Hello, I am Matthew Bowe, CEO for Cushman and Wakefield across Asia Pacific. Welcome to everyone on today's webinar. We are excited to be presenting today. We recently held a similar webinar for our clients across the Americas and EMEA. We had fantastic attendance with north of 12,000 people attend the webinar. It was a great webinar, tons of questions and some wonderful feedback. We hope you all find this webinar as valuable as our clients in the Northern Hemisphere did. So on today's webinar, we're going to take you through an overview of our how-to guide for reopening the workplace. As we will cover in more detail, this how-to guide essentially provides landlords and tenants with the best practices and protocols needed to return people back to work in a safe and timely manner. Just some quick background, the development of this guide really started with a 300-page return to work manual that was prepared by our business across mainland China. Since the start of this year, our team in China have helped manage over 1 million people return to work on behalf of something like 10,000 companies. This includes returning our own workforce to 26 Cushman and Wakefield offices across mainland China. So we took this 300-page manual and the learnings from our colleagues in China and set up a task force of Cushman and Wakefield professionals from all over the world. This included partnering with a variety of external subject matter experts. So over the last 6 weeks, we have been working around the clock to develop a blueprint for returning people back to work. As part of this, our global task force has also been actively advising numerous industry bodies and associations. Additionally, we're working closely with the Business Roundtable, an association of chief executive officers of America's leading companies, issuing recommendations on key recovery issues to the US federal administration. It is important to mention that we have intentionally included thought leaders and experts from all over the world to ensure the guide is adaptable across countries and customizable for different industries and commercial real estate verticals. So today's presenters, we've assembled a wonderful group of presenters for today. Our first presenter is Bill Knightley, COO for our global occupier business based in Chicago. So Bill will start by providing an overview of our how-to guide. Our second presenter is Chris Brown. Based in Singapore, Chris leads our global occupier services platform across Asia Pacific. Chris will give us some insight into what day one might look like. He will also provide an overview of our 6-feet office design concept. And our third presenter is Sean Wang, based in Beijing. Sean leads our North China business. Sean will take us through the lessons learned from returning 1 million people back to work across mainland China. Sean will also give us some interesting insight in how the use of technology has helped landlords and occupiers navigate the return to work. The intention is to run through these presentations relatively quickly so we can leave 25 to 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you all for spending some of your morning with us here so we can share some of our learnings that we've gathered from around the world. Of course, our attendees today represent many organizations. We have landlords, we have tenants, small and large enterprises, participants across several industries, and even those in the public sector and nonprofit sector. For those of you that have not yet downloaded our 34-page recovery readiness guide, you can do so now at cushwake.com and follow along as we introduce the guide here. Important to note, these materials are intended to just be a foundation and applicable to a fairly broad audience. There's much more detail in the guide. We have some recent releases as well as future releases that will be coming out soon, addressing specific asset classes and industry verticals. Of course, this is a public health issue that we're dealing with, and our foundation for any of our recommendations are rooted in guidance from the WHO as well as other public health organizations from around the world. So some of this may be familiar to many of you already. Our goal is to take these guidelines and create practical recommendations as we return to work. So first, collaboration is key. We have learned a lot from our colleagues all around the world, particularly in parts of Asia, where we have already returned to work in certain phases, as well as those clients that are never really left because they're performing essential activities all around the world, whether it's manufacturing, food service, etc. What we do know is that this will be very complex and happen in phases. It's likely to look different depending on which organization you're in. And progress, unfortunately, is likely to be linear. We've seen the rules of the game change, if not by the week or day, maybe even the hour, from day to day. One thing Cushman will continue to do, though, is partner with the most innovative experts in the world as the situation evolves. We've believed from the get-go that collaboration is key, and as such encourage landlords and tenants, corporates and suppliers, all other stakeholders to partner and collaborate through these challenging times, primarily focusing on health and safety of individuals. We've established the Global Recovery Readiness Task Force, chaired by our president, John Forrester, and led by the folks you see listed on the page. We've also partnered with many organizations around the world, two listed here in the Well Living Lab, a collaboration with Delos and the Mayo Clinic, as well as International SOS. It allows us, in addition to our own internal resources, 53,000 employees across 60 countries we learn from every day, to draw on a deep expertise on a number of topics. It could be workplace, cleaning, indoor air quality, safety, health and wellness, even business continuity. So we're really proud of the way that stakeholders across the globe are coming together and collaborating, and we're an active participant in that fashion. If you have the guide in front of you, you'll notice that it's largely laid out in chronological fashion. We start with preparing for day one. What should we be doing today in buildings? How should we be communicating and approaching the first phase of returning to work? Day one and beyond. How are people even going to get to their place of employment? Once they arrive, how do they enter the building? What's the workplace look like? What's different when they get there? And probably most importantly, how do they feel safe? And then finally, what's next? Since we originally published this guide, we've had several releases, new guidelines addressing new trends or information or guidance, and we'll continue to do so as we collaborate with the many partners and clients across the industry, including the Business Roundtable. That's been an incredible collaboration for us here in the United States. Many of you have likely seen the Safe Six in the press already, and we think this is a foundational framework that can be applied to multiple environments, not just office, but also other asset classes. Prepare the building, prepare the workforce, control access to the space, physical and social distancing, reducing touch points, and communication. These are the foundations. We'll go through these one by one quickly. First, prepare the building. This starts on page 6 in the guide. Focus, of course, here is on safety. There are maintenance procedures that should be happening right now while the building isn't heavily in use. And of course, before returning, there are basic assessments that should be completed. Instilling a sense of safety for people here is a key component, and we can't emphasize enough the collaboration involved in this process. It must be owned jointly by landlords, building managers, and the occupants. It's important to establish clear roles and responsibilities, as well as joint communication protocols that need to be agreed to adequately prepare the building and communicate to tenants and employees in advance of them returning. Basic safety is an obvious example. In addition to the mechanical maintenance, PPE needs to be provided. Stations need to be clearly labeled and accessible, where disinfectant is available, hand sanitizer, hand washing stations, laundry or disposal of PPE, and many other items. We have detailed checklists included in the guide to address some of this core infrastructure and building system considerations prior to returning to work. On page 9 in the guide, we transition to preparing the workforce. Of course, the workforce is going to return in phases. It's important for employers to decide who needs to return to the office and when. What groups of the workforce have proven to be highly productive at home, and in what scenario should they be coming to work to become more productive? On page 13 of the guide, we lay out several pros and cons for returning to work versus continuing to work from home. Of course, personal health should be prioritized here, especially as it relates to high-risk individuals. We need to display empathy for employees as they navigate this very stressful situation with heightened anxiety. Important to be clear and simple with protocols and policies, because we will all be asked to comply with new protocols in our space. It's often challenging to comply with certain things like taking a prescription medication that's given to us. It's going to be very hard to nudge people to wash their hands more, stop touching their faces, wipe down surface areas before and after arriving in a meeting room or a working area, etc. So lots of communications that must be done up front prior to employees returning to work, not just to help alleviate the fears, but also to help establish new habits. Access controls are going to be clearly very important and will vary depending on the type of space and the layout. Various screenings, whether they be self-disclosures, temperature checks, other screenings, will likely follow guidance of local health authorities, and oftentimes will also be left for interpretation, as certainly is the case in the United States right now. Having said that, we should all be planning for multiple scenarios around who's responsible and what the protocols are. We should be focusing on high traffic areas. Elevators are a key concern, entry exit points, lobbies, shipping and receiving. Handful of things to consider for an entrance. Reduce the number of entrances if possible while maintaining compliance with code. Also establish guides to maintain social distancing. Maybe it's taping off or painting off 6 feet or whatever the local jurisdiction guidance is. Finally, consider stage arrivals to avoid long lead time, long lines. We don't want everybody showing up at a workplace all at the same time and standing in a queue together. Creating a social distancing plan more broadly applies all around the world in every asset class. It doesn't matter if this is an office space, if this is retail, this is manufacturing. Most of us around the world are experiencing this already today, whether it's when we go to the grocery store or go to fill a gas tank or walk a pet. Before we even get to the workplace, we need to be considering the modes of transportation, which are going to clearly vary by location and by density of a city. It goes without saying that the workplace needs to be reconfigured. We've laid out some of this, some thoughts or ideas on how to manage this. We've seen many clients doing things like managing foot traffic patterns, temporarily closing small spaces or common areas, roping off common areas, managing restrooms, etc. So a lot to consider here. We go into pretty good depth on this in the guide and have released many things in the public as well around social distancing. Reducing touch points and increasing cleaning is probably the most obvious component here. The supply chain will likely be a challenge for some time. Leveraging large procurement organizations can be very helpful here to make sure that you have key supplies like hand sanitizer, disinfectant wipes, other cleaning supplies, various PPE on hand. Again, just mentioned change management as being critical to driving compliance with new cleaning protocols. We're also seeing an acceleration of technology in this space. So anything that we can do that is limited or no touch interaction, whether it be with fixtures or printers, various access points, even with elevators, we expect acceleration of these technology solutions to continue. And then finally, communicate for confidence. Throughout the guide, we emphasize the importance of transparent and frequent communication. And this is across all stakeholders. This isn't one way, employers to employees or employees back to employers. It's landlords and tenants. It's corporates and suppliers. We have to facilitate an open dialogue with safety in mind. There are a handful of recommendations included in the guide for this. Again, this presentation was meant to be a brief overview of the guide. You'll find 35 pages of content and much more on the website, and much more to come as well. Our subject matter experts around the world are working daily with our clients on even more detailed protocols, whether it be very detailed SOPs that we're applying in specific jurisdictions or for specific activities such as cleaning. And we will continue to partner with our clients, other industry participants, and medical experts around the globe, really with the ultimate goal of just trying to provide the safest environment possible as we all return to work around the world. So with that, I'd like to transition to Chris Brown for some thoughts on what day one could look like. Chris?
Thank you, Bill. We've had an unprecedented few weeks, and the focus on the workplace has been more topical than ever before. As an industry, we're very used to having definitive answers, and everyone is finding this uncertainty very difficult to manage. So Cushman & Wakefield's Recovery Readiness Guide is a roadmap to help our clients navigate the uncertainty and to approach the new normal on two horizons. Short term, to prepare a safe return to the office soon, and long term, to incorporate the learnings from the forced remote working period into an actionable long-term view on the workspace. So let me take you through it, starting with people. While workplace design, policies, and safety protocols are all critical pieces of the puzzle, the most important aspect of return to work will be the readiness of the workforce, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. As we get ready to return to work, there'll be many questions that organizations and their employees will start asking. Should we return to our work location? Am I more productive there? Do I need to be there physically to do my job? Or do I need to access different types of equipment? These are all questions for each company to consider. We already understood a lot about remote workers before the pandemic from Cushman & Wakefield's experience per square meter workplace diagnostic tool. And we've just completed the survey with our own workforce and many of our clients, and are currently evaluating the data to understand the experiences of our employees and clients during this difficult time. For Cushman & Wakefield employees, we're finding that our workplace experience has actually remained stable during this period. Those of us that worked flexibly before found it easier to adjust, but our millennials and Gen Z are struggling the most, as they often lack the space for focused work with minimal distraction. Not surprisingly, our salespeople are also struggling, whereas corporate functions like HR, finance, and IT seem to be doing fine. We'll be using the data we have collected to take direct and practical actions to ensure that leading up to, during, and after the return to work, we'll be successful in helping people not just move forward, but thrive. So what might day one look like? We've created a prototype of what the office might look like in the short term with our concept, the 6 feet office. This was developed by our team in Amsterdam. And whether you measure space in feet or meters, or whether your local restrictions stipulate a different safe distance, the concept of designing space for safe distancing is relevant to everyone. We are collaborating with industry experts and our partners, and we just announced a partnership with the Well Living Lab to test the 6 feet office concept and the quality of air filtration and surface hygiene. Health and safety is paramount, so as we explore the day in the life of someone coming back to work, removing touch points is essential, as 80% of common infections spread by hand. We're working with our clients and technology partners to test hands-free technology, including infrared temperature checks, facial recognition, voice-activated elevators, as well as the use of motion sensors to open doors, activate lighting, and blinds. But even basic behavioral changes can be highly effective. Simply changing how we move within the office space can also be impactful. Implementing an intentional clockwise traffic flow around rooms and adding one-way directional signage in hallways minimizes chances of congestion and bottlenecks among employees. When we approach planning of the workplace to maintain the safe distance required, incorporating buffer or alternate seating at workstations, collaborative spaces, and conference rooms is necessary to allow people for adequate space between themselves. Additional separation measures may include installing transparent partitions and staggering seating to avoid employees facing one another. We've also heard from our clients that there may be a larger request for unassigned seating, as people will potentially want to choose where to sit. The 6 feet office is a prototype. It's not a finished product. This is particularly important as we plan to test and develop it further with our clients to deal with different jurisdictions, building typologies, and the evolving medical data on the virus. Which brings me to my last slide. We've approached this return to work guide as a living document, which will continue to iterate and evolve as new information arises from medical and legal perspectives and from learning what our clients are testing themselves. Progress towards a business as usual will likely not be a linear process and is expected to vary both in timing and complexity from market to market. There'll be multiple variables to consider, including your company strategy and direction, landlord-driven guidelines, external factors and guidance from medical and legal, as well as policy and government regulations. The Recovery Readiness Guide will help you get people back to work safely in the short term, and we will continue to test solutions in the midterm to evolve a future model for the new business as usual. And it's important to note that we've now experienced a work-life integration that will change our perspectives and expectations of how we'll work in the future and what role of the workplace will be. So, and now I'd like to introduce Sean Wang, who will provide you insights from our experiences in Greater China.
Thank you, Chris. While China was hit by the COVID-19 virus perhaps 4 to 8 weeks ahead of the rest of the world, then China went through the worst phase in late February, early March, again 4 to 8 weeks ahead of the rest of the world. And now we're in full recovery phase, hopefully a few weeks yet ahead of the rest of the world. So on the next few slides, I'll describe what a recovery with still a threat of a virus hanging over one's heads look like, and what your recovery might look like in a few weeks. First of all, from a property manager's perspective, during the first few days of the outbreak, Cushman and Wakefield's property and facilities management team in Greater China updated the guidelines for handling an epidemic that was first developed during the SARS epidemic and distributed to the properties that were managed in China, so that immediately our colleagues would know what actions to take. And during the recovery process, it is the responsibility of the landlords and in turn the property manager to instill confidence in the occupiers. And again, our colleagues came through with a recovery guideline. So as a result, Cushman and Wakefield is helping corporate China get back to work. In fact, in our over 1,000 properties housing some 10,000 tenants with 1 million workers.
Sean, I think we've lost you. Yes. Sean, we're having trouble hearing you. What I might do, Sean, is while we try to get your connection back, we might just move to the Q&A and maybe come back to your section. So why don't we, I'll ask people, just while we're waiting for Sean to get back online, before we kick off the Q&A, I'd like to just introduce 3 panelists who will join our speakers for the Q&A session. We have Anshul Jain, who's based in Delhi, who leads our Indian and Southeast Asian businesses. Jun Soshi, based in Singapore, leads our facility management and asset services business across the region. And also joining us is Hideaki Suzuki, who is our head of research and consulting for Japan, and Hideaki's based in Tokyo. So to submit a question, please click on the Q&A icon on the top right-hand corner of your window and simply type in your question. I might just kick off with a question. Chris, maybe I'll throw this one your way. It's an interesting question that came up in the client seminar for the Americas and EMEA, but do you see a decline in the amount of space utilised by corporates long term across Asia Pacific? And what does densification look like in the future?
You know, I think that's a really important question that a lot of people are starting to consider. I think it's too early to tell what the overall impact will be, though. There was a recent survey of over 300 CFOs in the United States on a similar question, and the result was an estimated 5% reduction of space required. Now, we anticipate that companies will be more open to a broader, flexible working program, which will reduce the number of seats they will require in their offices. And this could have the effect of reducing the amount of space they require, but it's dependent on how their space is currently designed. And in addition, companies may change their workspace designs to ensure better safe distancing, like the 6 feet office concept. But this could have the effect of reducing their space density and subsequently an increase of space required. So it's going to be the combination of these two factors that ultimately determine the overall space requirement for each company.
Thanks, Chris. June, I've got a question that's come through. I think might throw this your way. Do you recommend additional cleaning and maintenance of HVAC systems to reduce the risk of COVID-19 spreading through an office environment?
Hey, Matt, and thanks. Yeah, I think we're getting that type of question quite a bit from our client base, and especially as we focus on the recovery readiness phase, which is getting the office ready or the building ready for tenants and occupiers that come back. And there, really the objective is to restore the indoor air quality. You could imagine many of these workplaces or buildings have been fairly sort of empty or partially occupied. So really it's using this the days ahead of day one to really run the HVAC systems, just really clear the air in terms of just restoring the indoor air quality. And then also sort of consider upgrading filters to capture sort of finer particulates and dust. And then finally, maybe beyond day one, is incorporating technology such as indoor air quality monitors, just to ensure that the indoor sort of air quality is maintained, and then that'll adjust sort of the frequency of the maintenance and operation of those systems. And all of this is to just contribute to the overall wellness and health of a workplace building. Yeah, that's sort of the approaches that we'll be seeing going forward, Matt.
Terrific, thank you, June. Bill, there's an interesting question coming in I wouldn't mind throwing your way. How do you get effective collaboration and partnership between landlords and tenants? How do tenants coordinate with other tenants in the building?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I feel like a broken record these days how often I'm saying collaboration and partnership, because we couldn't really feel more strongly on how critical this is. It's quite possible that the relationships between building owners and tenants, as an example, have never been more important. I think it starts with a mutual recognition or point of departure that this is a public health crisis, and our primary objective must be the safety and health of individuals. And accordingly, this has to be viewed as a shared responsibility across landlords and tenants, as well as other service providers in the space. So far, we've seen this done most effectively when all stakeholders start communicating fairly early and then continue that cadence to be quite often. It's also important to share in the communication process with tenants and service providers in the building. What you can achieve if you're collaborating in that communication process is a greater sense of safety and security that obviously will be critical as folks start returning to work. And then finally, I think it's obvious to everyone on this call that the financial viability of a tenant, especially in the long term, is very key to stable occupancy. So in this particular scenario, being a public health crisis, it also just makes good business sense to partner here for the long term.
Terrific, thanks, Bill. Anshul, I might throw this to you in Delhi. With India being so densely populated, how will social distancing work in the office from an Indian perspective?
Yeah, yes, Matt, thanks for that. I think there'll be 3 phases post reopening. There would be a phase of heightened alert. Then there'll be a phase of just general alertness, and then third phase would be good practices, continuing good practices. I think in heightened alert, there'd probably be 20 to 30% of the people returning to offices, alert probably about 50, and good practices maximum maybe about 70-75% on a continuing basis. And that will allow us some time to work through the density of population trying to enter the buildings. Ultimately, it's going to boil down towards protection, a good balance or a fine balance between protection and social distancing. It's something the airlines have been talking about, because the social distancing of 6 feet or 3 feet is just not possible within the airlines industry, at least in the medium term. And therefore, a lot of focus will be on personal protection and the PPEs and how that evolves over a period of time. For the elevators, it's just not possible at 60-70% capacity of the buildings. Even now, or pre-COVID, it used to take 10 to 15 minutes at times in most dense buildings. Going forward, again, I think we've got to rely on protection so that we can get people up to their floors for their work. So that is how I think things will change as we move forward.
Thank you, Anshul. Very, very insightful. So, Hodiaki, you've got a question here for you. Thanks for joining us. Do you think the impact of COVID-19 will change the way people work and live in Tokyo?
Right, thanks, Matt. Yes, absolutely. We're not going back to pre-COVID situation for sure. Especially this might be leading a bit of paradigm shift in terms of how people work and live in Japan and Tokyo. One significant thing that we're expecting to see is remote working will be a new normal. Japan has been lagging way behind its global peers in the past in terms of working environment, which has diluted Japan's attractiveness as a global job market, despite its large economic scalability. For example, before COVID-19 in Japan, only less than 10% of companies adopted a teleworking option for their staffs. Some corporates, they originally thought they couldn't do it, and some corporates say they would do it, but just delaying for a very long time. However, because of this situation, almost forcing everybody to work from home would definitely facilitate the option to be adopted quicker in a permanent way. And obviously, alongside of this, digitalization will come also coming on the way due course. And this will definitely provide greater flexibility to a number of people, and especially for women who are keen to return to work. It has been really a long-standing issue in Japan, where women face significant difficulty in returning to work after having maternity leave. So the outbreak has definitely impacted on the economy, which is terrible, but there's a little bit of positive side of it, and it's definitely improving working environment in Japan, Matt.
Thanks, Hodiaki. All right, Chris, I might throw to you. It's an interesting question. Will organisations need more staff to manage their workplace? Concierge, managing common areas within the tenancy and the broader building?
Yeah, I think absolutely it will be the case. When you think of the staff, you have to think about the different parts of the building that'll come into impact here. Clearly at the building entry, we've already seen the temperature screening. I think there'll be different forms of screening as this evolves, and so more staff will be required at that front entrance to manage the intake of employees. More cleaning staff will probably be required throughout the building, both in the common areas, the elevators and lifts, the restroom facilities, as well as within the office space, because of the expectation of that higher cleaning standard. And then within your space, I think there's also the need for additional support requirements to help employees manage, to be able to direct staff accordingly to ensure that the office space itself is maintaining its cleanliness and safe distancing. So I think really across the board, you're going to see a lift of some additional staffing. Hopefully over time, technology will come into play and be able to reduce that back down to maintain a good cost balance.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think what we might do, because Sean has some very interesting slides for us to cover about, what we've learned from our colleagues across mainland China. Sean, I'm going to throw to you again, see if we can get you back online. If the team can bring Sean's slides back up, please. All right, Sean,
Matt,
over to you. Take two.
Matthew, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. All right. So really, since mid to late March, mainland China has gradually started the post-pandemic recovery process, city by city, province by province. By now, most of us are back to work, but this is no way the kind of work that was like pre-COVID-19 days. So now what does recovery look like, and what it might look like for you in 4 to 6 weeks? First of all, the commute is now vastly changed. People are choosing to walk, ride the bicycle, or even drive to work, as public transit is still crowded and considered dangerous even if it's running at 50% capacity. So traffic jams are probably worse than ever in a lot of large Chinese cities. And once you get to the outside of your office building, if it's 8:30 to 9 o'clock, there's usually a queue outside the entrance, so that the building really encourages its occupiers to implement staggered start time, because otherwise during peak hours, the queues would be nearly unmanageable. And where are usually many entrances, as Bill indicated, now there's usually one entrance and one exit to a building. So common experience as you enter a building, there's first a disinfectant area for the bottom of your shoes. Then you have your temperature taken with an infrared thermometer. And then usually there's a QR code that you scan with your smartphone that's going to show you where you have been or whether you have been out of the city over the last 2 weeks and 4 weeks. Once you get to the elevator lobby after you pass the checkpoint, there's usually a signage in the lobby that limits the number of passengers in an elevator car. And there's usually tissue in the elevator lobby for pushing buttons to eliminate contact with the button with your bare finger if possible. And then inside the elevator, there's usually a plastic shield covering the buttons. And there's a sign that indicates what time the elevator was last disinfected. And it's usually within the hour. So when you get to your office space, now there's a clear and strict set of guidelines. There's a wind meter here in Beijing that needs to separate between staff, and every staff needs to occupy at least 2.5 square meters of space. And your offices and conference rooms now have reduced maximum capacity. So what does it all boil down to? There's a new normal. There's a new way of working. Flexible hours. A lot of meeting apps are being used. And there's a use of social media as a marketing tool like never before. Next slide, please. So here we go. On the left, the first picture is an example of a virtual tour that we produce for pretty much every building that we are marketing. The second picture shows a mobile app developed by the Cushman and Wakefield team here in China that allows the potential tenant to find a building on a map and then view the spaces online. The third picture is an example of a TikTok video made for a shopping mall that we're currently leasing. So these tools are helping our clients to make real estate decisions with as few visits as site visits as possible. And we have seen an exponential increase in the use of these technologies. Next slide. So in terms of the lessons that we've learned in this process, well, I think first of all, the government here is very firm and strict with its lockdown and social distancing rules. And the citizens here, by and large, follow these rules. The government makes us wear masks, and people wear masks. There are also smartphone apps that allow the government to track people's movements. There's a bit of a trade-off with privacy for some confidence that the people that are in your building are as hopefully healthy as you are. And from the property management perspective, you have to have updated pandemic response and recovery manuals ready, and you have to respond quickly to fast-changing government guidelines. And you have to be resourceful in terms of procuring personal protective equipment and staffing. And what all of this boils down to is there's an increase in cost in terms of overtime, equipment, and consumables. And for the occupiers, you have to be flexible and stay up to date on the latest guidelines. And you have to be prepared that the commute is going to be longer. The queues outside of the buildings are going to be longer, and there are going to be queues where there were no queues. And communication is absolutely critical in overcoming your employees' concerns and fears. So in a nutshell, things are not perfect here. I mean, there are adjustments that need to be made on a daily basis, but we are back to work, and so will you. Now back to you, Matt.
Terrific, Sean. Glad we got you back online. Thank you very much. June, I might throw this question to you. Do you have recommendations on operating common areas like lunchrooms, coffee breakout areas to comply with social distancing?
Sure, Matt. Yeah, I think lunchrooms, kitchenettes, breakout areas, other common areas are really critical, important amenities. Not just for sort of the operation of the office, but I think for the general well-being of the employees as they return to work. I think every effort's going to be made to see how we can operate and use these types of spaces safely. And I think Bill and Chris have already touched on a lot of the operating principles that would apply and would be critical to operate common areas. So things like cleanliness, hygiene, safe distancing, contactless devices will be key. I mean, some examples of that would be, so it's just hygiene and cleaning protocols regarding sort of more frequent cleaning of these areas, introducing sort of touchless devices like hand sanitizer dispensers, maybe sort of touchless faucets, and then sort of use of sort of disposable coffee cups are some examples. And in terms of just implementing safe distancing, reducing capacity in these spaces, staggered use are some of the other examples that we will see, Matt.
Great, thank you, June, and thank you to all those people that are tons of questions coming in. So I'm just trying to condense them as best I can. Bill, a question on the retail sector. How does the retail sector return to work? Do retailers need to go through a similar process? And what are some of the things retailers need to think about?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Sean. That was phenomenal. As much as we've heard from you previously, hearing it live in this setting is really quite impressive. It's obvious to all that the retail sector was under enormous pressure prior to the pandemic, and that's certainly only accelerated what was already in motion. We have a unique experience, I think, with retail, just given the breadth of our client base around the world, so operating in many different jurisdictions as they come back online, but also many essential retailers that never went offline. So that's pharmacies, quick service restaurants, grocery stores, as some examples. And the use of the Safe Six, I think Chris referenced this being applicable to many asset classes, being a good template. It's, of course, directly applicable here. Many of us are experiencing this every day. You have to go to the grocery store. I'm sure we can all reflect on the last time we were there and we stood in a queue before we were allowed to enter the premises to minimize density inside. Once inside, we probably found ourselves being shuffled around. One aisle, aisle 9 is one direction, aisle 10 is another direction, or queuing in certain aisles all the way to the back of the store. Once we got to the checkout register, there was probably a sneeze and cough barrier at the register, and they were probably encouraging touchless checkout. So this is going to be a huge consideration. Retailers are going to have to pay very close attention to the store environment. I think those that innovate and accelerate the adoption of technology, from things like touchless technology to even virtual reality type shopping environments, and those that can do the most to create confidence in their communications for the shopper, addressing basics like cleaning frequency, hand sanitizer, etc. I think at the end of the day, the retailers that can innovate and do the most to ensure safety are likely the ones that are going to be able to attract the most business in the early days as we return to work. But no doubt a huge consideration in this particular asset class.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, Bill. I suppose it goes without saying, I think retail is certainly one of the most innovative and adaptive verticals within commercial real estate, and I think we'll continue to see some very interesting, probably exciting changes. Anshul, India has a very large BPO market and has been using office space very efficiently. Is the 6-foot office concept practical in India?
I think there are lots of nuances of 6-foot offices, right? So there is, stuff like how the circulation within offices should take place, how the office common areas should be used, whether we use transparent plastic screen to provide as shields, and of course the physical distance itself. So I think the 6-foot concept is a combination of a number of aspects. What I do think as a result, and I think Chris mentioned this before, that as a result of this pandemic, the density in office will certainly decrease. Now, whether it'll decrease to an extent that will create 6-foot distances in environments in India and indeed in Asia, I'm not so sure yet. But what is certain is that there would be a de-densification of offices, with employers giving more choices and more flexibility to people out there to work from wherever they want to work. But don't forget that 70-80% of our population, our working population, is actually the millennials and Gen Zs and a fairly young population who often go back home or are living with in shared accommodation with friends, often having roommates and flatmates. And often those guys are actually working for competition of whichever firms your people may be working for. And therefore, working from home is not often a practical solution. And therefore, if you come back to offices where you have to de-densify, ultimately, I think the employers will be forced to balance the de-densification, the 6-foot offices, and perhaps be forced to increase the workspace a little bit. So all of that is developing. We'll see how it goes. But in a nutshell, there will be de-densification. Whether it'll go as far as creating 6 feet physical separation between desks, we are not so sure yet.
Yeah, and Anshul, if I could build on that just a little bit. So, while we've coined the 6 feet office because of the guidance in Amsterdam and the way that country is looking at the safe distancing, there are a number of markets, Singapore specifically, that's at a 1 meter distance. And so I think, the challenge for all companies will be, that regulatory standard is likely to vary country to country. And so you're going to have to work to understand what those local requirements are. And I think in time, that ability to understand what is the proper safe distance, that's going to be, what will be an outcome coming from the medical community as they have the ability to test and better understand this particular, pandemic, with COVID. It could be something different. So it's a fluid situation. And that's why I think so many of the protocols really focus on, what you can do to protect yourself and what the practices are. The science of the distance will take a little bit more time to fully settle on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting, Chris. I think the other thing you mentioned, Anshul, which is a fascinating statistic about the proportion of millennials and I suppose Gen Zs, is and I think, Chris, you mentioned it through surveys and our experience per square foot engagement tool is millennials and Gen Z really struggling with the whole work from home concept far more than other generational groups. And I think that's fascinating in itself. Sean, this is a simple question, but what kind of PPE have companies in China provided to office workers?
Sure, Matt. Mostly masks. You've got to have sufficient supply of masks within the office, and then there's tissues and hand sanitizers and disinfectants. I think really more than the increased uses, just the presence of these items provides a certain confidence to your employees. So, and make them wear them. It's not comfortable, but it does provide some assurance to your employees that their coworkers are protecting themselves.
Thanks, Sean. Just on what we're sort of covering, density, interesting from a Japanese perspective, Hideaki, given the high density of office space, especially within domestic Japanese companies, what's sort of the lens of the 6 feet office? Is that practical? Is it similar to what Anshul was articulating on behalf of India?
Right. Yes. Actually, it is practical to Japanese market as well. I think if you see the concept for the first time, it really appears requiring larger workstation per person. More space is needed to make people feel comfortable to be back to the office, and more importantly, protect their health. And the question is really whether or not Japanese corporates will be able to fit everybody into the current office setting. It is true that Japanese corporates tend to have higher density in the office space, but what they're currently working on and adapting right now is the so-called grouping approach. And with that approach, not everybody will go back to the office in the short term. And in this approach, mainly two groups will be set out based on the nature of their works. One is essential office workers group, which includes people who are required to be in the office due to the nature of their role. And the other group is, of course, teleworkers group or flex workers group, who don't necessarily need to be in the office and can do much of their works at home. And with this grouping, basically people within the essential office workers group will rotate their office working days. For example, okay, these people will be working from Monday to Wednesday, and this group will be working from Thursday to Friday in the office. And an immediate benefit of the 6 feet office concept is more for those people and more to assist those who are returning to the office. And once the situation subsides and they reach to the point where everybody feels comfortable fully going back to the office and ready for active face-to-face collaboration again, and that will be the timing to consider a next step of workplace strategy. For example, currently the co-working space and satellite offices in Japan are being affected because of the social distancing at the moment. But if you look at those flex spaces, they can actually offer greater flexibility in terms of workplace solution and workplace experience to people. So there will be several steps, and yes, the 6 feet office will offer the first step to take, which is definitely applicable for Japanese corporates, Matt.
Great, thank you, Hideaki. Sean, as you think about the lessons learned from mainland China, what would you classify as the top 2 to 3 lessons learned from returning 1 million people back to their place of business?
Sure, Matt. I think here, it would be very helpful for your employees to understand exactly what's expected of them. Governments would issue guidelines, and some of these guidelines are specific enough to follow, but a lot of times they're not. This is why the recovery guidelines that Cushman and Wakefield publishes are so important, because they tell you specifically what the employees can do and what actions they should take in terms of social distancing and so forth. So that's one thing. So very actionable guidelines. 2, in terms of the occupiers, you have to instill some confidence in your employees and that it's a safe environment. So as I mentioned, so you have all these increased frequency of cleaning, and you have all the PPEs available for the employees. So that's another thing. The last thing I want to mention is everyone needs to be a little bit more patient because the queues are going to be a little bit longer. The commute could be longer, so we can all use a little patience. Back to you, Matt.
Yeah, good advice. Thanks, Sean. Just conscious of time, Chris, I'll throw this one to you. Probably got time for maybe one or two questions. What is Cushman and Wakefield's view on the role of the workplace? How was that changed? Why don't we all just continue working from home?
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people want to try and consider. I think the reality is, and it's been touched on by a number of our answers here today, so much of the work from home versus work from office or the physical environment where the work is performed is driven by the role. There's just a number of roles that it's not effective to be at home. And so I think, the first real lens is that role segregation. I think Hideaki said it really well. There's a number of roles that can be flexed, a number that need to be in the office. So, I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where everybody's working at home. It'll be driven by that particular requirement. I do think, though, that everyone's going to reevaluate the strategy of incorporating work from home as part of the mix of what they do. That'll allow them to balance the cost equation of higher support in the office with the potential to have to increase the area per person to assure the safe distancing. So you're trying to balance a combination of the health and safety, the practicality of being productive in your job, and the cost of doing it. So it's going to be a little bit of a different equation for everybody, but I definitely don't see that we'll have a significant percentage working at home all the time.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Bill, I might throw you the last question, and I think this is certainly a contentious question. Are there any legal or privacy issues that we need to consider around temperature checking for people coming into buildings?
Yes, is the very short answer, and it's an incredibly hot topic right now. And first off, many of the callers, I think all the speakers rather, on this call have referenced different rules, different guidelines, different regulations in different locales. This one is no doubt very country specific, where different privacy laws exist, which of course inherently creates an enormous challenge for large multinational employers to navigate. Second, and we're hearing this from many Fortune 500 companies, other multinational corporations around the world, there's a popular view forming that if someone entering the workplace is expressing symptoms like an elevated temperature, it's quite possible that that individual was contagious earlier. Maybe even several days earlier. So there's almost a view that it could be too late. And then finally, while temperature screenings in certain countries feel maybe more commonplace or more accepted, in many parts of the world, this will feel new and different. It could cause further anxiety and stress as we return to work for all people in the environment. So right now we're just trying to stay in very active dialogue with all of our clients, our peers, various health authorities and governing bodies around the world on literally on a daily basis, monitoring for best practices here and learning. And Sean mentioned some of the learnings in past tense in China. We're now starting to gather learnings from other countries and other environments around the world, and we'll of course continue to do so and share.
Thanks, Bill. Just before we finish up, there is an interesting question. Can you put on your epidemiologist hat for a second? I know you've sort of taken that role as proxy for us across the business, but can the virus spread via the HVAC systems? Is there any research to date that gives us any insight into that question?
This is another one that is an incredibly hot topic right now. Some parts of the world have pretty strongly recommended maybe more extensive protocols related to HVAC. Other parts of the world have yet to declare that the virus can be transmitted in an airborne method. So I think we're still at the stage with the understanding of this virus as it relates to transmission, as well as it relates to effectiveness of antibodies or the recurrence of expressing symptoms or being contagious, that it's probably hard to say. And I wouldn't want to make a general statement, given that different governing bodies and different health organizations around the world haven't expressed consistent views. It's another thing that makes the situation incredibly challenging, in that, especially for large multinationals that are operating in multiple jurisdictions, the guidance is not always consistent, nor is it always clear, so it needs to be interpreted. So I guess just with that, maybe in closing from my perspective, Matt, we believe it's super critical for everybody to regularly, and that's at least daily, be checking what their local health authority or public health officials' guidance is, what the local government guidance is, whether that be your federal government, your local government, your county, state, whatever it might be, government, and quite frankly, also check out with websites that are containing information, including ours. We're publishing new information on a very regular basis, and the facts and circumstances will continue to evolve. We're going to learn a lot more as large populations around the world continue to return to work, and we just have to recognize this is an incredibly fluid situation, and we do our best to continue to collaborate and share ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I might just labour on that point. So, our website will be updated regularly to reflect changes, in trends and regulations, and as medical research evolves. So this will provide, a real-time guide, for everyone on this call as we all try to navigate, as landlords and tenants and building managers and navigate the return to work. So, check that out. We will be also sending attendees of the call a follow-up email which has a link to the guide and other collateral we've prepared. I do apologise, we had some really wonderful questions we weren't able to cover. We hope you found today's webinar valuable. Should you require any assistance with your own return to work plans, our Cushman and Wakefield professionals are ready to help. With that, thank you for joining us on today's webinar.